at 6:42 a.m. on February 14th, 2019, as Valentine's Day dawned over a quiet residential block on the south side of Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Police dispatch received a call that immediately cut through the softness of the morning. A woman's voice, shaking and breathless, struggled to explain what she had just found inside a beige townhouse at the end of a narrow cul-de-sac. Outside, the air was cool, the sky still dim with early morning haze, and pink Valentine's balloons tied to mailboxes swayed gently in the breeze, celebrating love in a neighborhood that had no idea it was about to become a crime scene. Inside that townhouse, on a bedroom floor still scattered with rose petals from the night before, lay the body of 28-year-old Marissa Cole, her Valentine's Day never arriving, her life violently interrupted by the one person who was supposed to protect her. When officers arrived minutes later, they found signs that something had gone terribly wrong long before that morning. The front door was unlocked. A single high-heeled shoe rested near the couch, as if it had been kicked off in a hurry. On the kitchen counter sat an unopened box of chocolates, a handwritten Valentine's card beside it, still pristine, never read. And in the bedroom, beneath soft lighting that had likely been meant to set a romantic mood, Marissa lay cold and unresponsive, her body bearing unmistakable signs of a violent struggle. There was no sign of forced entry, no broken windows, no evidence of a stranger. The room told a different story, one of intimacy, rage, and betrayal. The kind of story that begins with love and ends with murder. As detectives began sealing off the home, neighbors gathered outside, whispering in disbelief. Many of them recognized Marissa. She was friendly, warm, and always smiling. The kind of person who remembered birthdays and checked in on people just because she cared. Just hours earlier, she had been alive, exchanging Valentine's messages, posting a photo of red roses and a caption that read, "Love is complicated, but tonight feels right." By sunrise, she was gone, and the man who had spent Valentine's Eve with her, her boyfriend, Derek Vaughn, was nowhere to be found. Moments like this are why these stories matter. As you listen, take a second to settle in. And if you find yourself drawn into the details, quietly supporting the channel by liking, commenting, or subscribing helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. Because what happened to Marissa Cole is not just a crime, it's a warning. The official timeline would later show that Marissa was last seen alive at 11:18 p.m. on February 13th, just hours before Valentine's Day. She and Derek had been spotted leaving a popular downtown restaurant, their hands intertwined, laughing as if nothing in the world could touch them. Surveillance footage captured Derek holding the door open for her, leaning in to whisper something that made her smile. To anyone watching, they looked like a couple in love. What no one could see was the tension simmering just beneath the surface, or the argument that had already begun long before dessert arrived at the table. By the time detectives processed the scene that morning, one detail stood out with chilling clarity. Marissa had been killed sometime between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m., during the quietest hours of Valentine's night, when most of the city was asleep and love songs still echoed faintly from nearby bars. Her phone was missing. Her car was still parked outside, and Derek Vaughn, the man who had promised her forever, had effectively vanished. To understand how a Valentine celebration turned into a homicide investigation, detectives knew they had to rewind, back past the flashing lights, past the crime scene tape, past the shock that gripped Baton Rouge that morning. They had to go back to where it all began. Marissa Cole grew up believing deeply in love. Friends often described her as hopeful to a fault, someone who saw the best in people even when the warning signs were obvious to everyone else. She worked as a marketing coordinator for a local real estate firm, a job she took pride in, and she had a reputation for being reliable, driven, and endlessly optimistic. Her social media was filled with photos of weekend brunches, family gatherings, and inspirational quotes about patience and growth. She wasn't naive, but she believed love could fix things, even broken people. She met Derek Vaughn 2 years earlier at a mutual friend's birthday party. Derek was charming, confident, and magnetic in a way that made people lean in when he spoke. He worked in logistics, had a steady income, and knew how to present himself as someone dependable. In the early days, he was attentive to the point of intensity, texting constantly, showing up unannounced with gifts, insisting on being involved in every part of Marissa's life. At first, it felt flattering. Later, it felt suffocating. Friends noticed changes before Marissa ever admitted them. She canceled plans more often. She checked her phone obsessively. She began asking permission instead of making decisions. When questioned, she brushed it off with nervous laughter, saying Derek just cared a lot, or that relationships required compromise. If you're watching this and recognizing familiar patterns, you're not alone. And that's exactly why conversations in the comments matter more than people realize. By the winter of 2018, cracks had formed. Derek accused Marissa of flirting when she stayed late at work. He questioned her friendships, especially with male co-workers. Arguments became frequent, emotional, and exhausting. On more than one occasion, neighbors heard raised voices coming from Marissa's townhouse, followed by long stretches of silence. She confided in a close friend that she felt like she was walking on glass, never sure which version of Derek she would get on any given day. Still, Valentine's Day was approaching, and Derek seemed determined to make it count. He apologized. He promised change. He talked about the future, marriage, stability, fresh starts. Marissa wanted to believe him. She wanted this Valentine's Day to mean something, to mark a turning point instead of another disappointment. And so, when Derek suggested a romantic dinner and a quiet night together, she said yes. What no one could have predicted was that Valentine's Day would become the final chapter of Marissa Cole's life. As the investigation unfolded, detectives would soon uncover messages, witness statements, and movements that painted a far darker picture of that night, one that contradicted Derek's carefully crafted image. But in this first part of the story, the most haunting truth is this. By the time the roses were laid out and the candles were lit, the decision had already been made. Valentine's Day was meant for love. He chose murder instead. If this story is already pulling you in, stay with it. These details matter, and supporting the channel ensures stories like Marissa's are not forgotten. By the time the sun fully rose over Baton Rouge on Valentine's morning, detectives were already piecing together a version of the night that looked nothing like the romantic evening Marissa Cole had hoped for. What initially appeared to be a private tragedy between two lovers was beginning to reveal itself as something far more calculated, far more disturbing. Every object inside that townhouse seemed to whisper fragments of a story that Marissa could no longer tell, and investigators knew that the answers would not come quickly. They never do in cases where love and violence collide. Detectives started where they always do: Marissa's phone records, social media activity, and personal messages. Friends had already begun reaching out to police, insisting that Marissa would never simply disappear or ignore messages on Valentine's Day of all days. When investigators accessed her cloud backups, they discovered weeks of conversations between Marissa and Derek that painted a relationship on the brink of collapse. The tone shifted drastically depending on Derek's mood. One moment he was apologetic, pleading, promising to be better. The next, he was accusatory, possessive, and cold, questioning her loyalty, demanding reassurance, and reminding her of how much he had sacrificed for her. One message exchange from just 5 days before Valentine's Day stood out. Marissa had written that she needed space, that she felt emotionally drained and overwhelmed by the constant tension. Derek responded with a long string of messages that swung wildly between remorse and veiled threats. He told her he couldn't imagine life without her, that she was everything to him, and then, almost seamlessly, that if she walked away after all he had done, she would regret it. To anyone reading it with fresh eyes, the manipulation was unmistakable. To Marissa, who had lived inside that emotional cycle for years, it was just another exhausting argument she hoped would fade. As the day progressed, police canvassed the neighborhood. A neighbor 2 houses down reported hearing raised voices sometime after midnight. She initially assumed it was a couple arguing and tried to ignore it, but she remembered the sound distinctly because it escalated so quickly, from shouting to a sudden, sharp crash that made her heart jump. She told detectives the noise stopped abruptly, followed by an eerie silence that felt wrong even then. At the time, she didn't call it in. On Valentine's night, people assume arguments are emotional but temporary. That hesitation would later haunt her. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses added another layer of unease. Derek Vaughn's car was captured on a traffic camera at 2:11 a.m., heading away from Marissa's neighborhood at a speed slightly above normal for that stretch of road. He was alone. No stops. No hesitation. Just a steady departure into the dark. What he was doing in those moments, and what he left behind, would soon become the center of the investigation. Detectives attempted to contact Derek that afternoon. Calls went unanswered. Messages were unread. By evening, concern had turned into urgency. Derek's phone finally pinged off a tower nearly 70 miles east, close to the Mississippi border. That discovery immediately raised red flags. People don't leave town without explanation on Valentine's Day unless they are running from something or someone. As investigators dug deeper, Marissa's friends began sharing what they had been afraid to say while she was alive. One friend admitted that Marissa had confided in her about feeling trapped, about Derek's jealousy becoming increasingly aggressive, about moments where she feared his temper more than she wanted to admit. Another friend revealed that Marissa had quietly looked into changing the locks weeks earlier, but decided against it after Derek calmed down. Each revelation added weight to the growing sense that Marissa had been living in danger long before Valentine's night. If you're finding yourself emotionally invested at this point, you're not alone. These stories stay with us because they are painfully human. Supporting the channel through engagement helps keep these conversations alive, especially for those who may recognize themselves in Marissa's story. Late that evening, forensic results began to come back from the crime scene. The findings were devastating. Marissa had not died quickly. Evidence suggested a prolonged struggle, defensive wounds on her arms, bruising around her wrists, signs that she had fought desperately to survive. The cause of death was manual strangulation, a deeply personal act that requires sustained force and intention. This was not an accident. It was not a momentary lapse. It was rage, exerted slowly, deliberately, by someone who was close enough to look into her eyes as he did it. The Valentine's card on the counter, addressed in Derek's handwriting, became one of the most haunting pieces of evidence. Inside, he had written about forever, about promises, about love enduring all things. The irony was suffocating. Investigators couldn't help but note that the card had never been opened. Whether Marissa never got the chance, or whether she chose not to read it, remained unknown. Either possibility made the moment even heavier. Meanwhile, Derek's disappearance was becoming impossible to ignore. Law enforcement issued a statewide alert, urging anyone with information on his whereabouts to come forward. Media outlets picked up the story, and by nightfall, Marissa's face was everywhere. Smiling photos contrasted against headlines that spoke of betrayal and violence. Valentine's Day, a day meant to celebrate connection, had become a grim reminder of how dangerous love can become when control replaces care. Behind the scenes, detectives were preparing for what they suspected was inevitable. They believed Derek was not just fleeing grief or shock. He was actively trying to stay ahead of the consequences. His financial records showed a sudden cash withdrawal in the early hours of the morning. His social media accounts went silent. And then, just before midnight, police received a tip that would change everything. A clerk at a roadside motel near the state line reported checking in a man matching Derek Vaughn's description earlier that afternoon. He paid in cash. He looked exhausted, and when asked how long he planned to stay, he hesitated before answering. Just one night. As investigators prepared to move, one truth was becoming increasingly clear. Whatever happened inside that townhouse was not a crime of passion that exploded out of nowhere. It was the culmination of control, fear, and unresolved violence that had been building for months, possibly years. Valentine's Day was simply the moment when it finally reached its breaking point. Stories like this don't end neatly. They unravel slowly, painfully, revealing truths that are harder to face than the crime itself. If you're still here, still listening, you're part of why these stories matter, and why remembering Marissa Cole matters. The motel sat just off the highway, the kind of place people stopped when they did not want to be remembered. Its sign flickered weakly against the night sky, casting intermittent light across a parking lot stained by years of oil leaks and neglect. When law enforcement arrived just after 1:30 a.m., Valentine's Day had officially ended, but the consequences of that night were only beginning to unfold. Officers moved quietly, acutely aware that the man inside room 214 was not just a suspect, but someone believed to be capable of extreme violence when cornered. Inside the room, Derek Vaughn was awake. He had not slept. His clothes from the night before lay crumpled near the bed, and his phone sat face down on the nightstand, powered off. When officers knocked and announced themselves, there was a pause long enough to tighten every muscle in their bodies. Then the door opened slowly. Derek did not resist. He looked hollow, drained, like someone who had been carrying a crushing weight for hours without release. In that moment, he did not look like a man in love or a man in grief. He looked like a man who knew exactly what he had done. Back in Baton Rouge, Marissa Cole's family gathered in stunned silence as news broke of Derek's arrest. Valentine's flowers from friends and co-workers lined the living room, their colors vibrant and cruelly out of place. Less than 24 hours earlier, Marissa had been alive, hopeful, still believing that love might somehow overcome fear. Now her name was being spoken in the past tense, her future reduced to memories and unanswered questions. For her parents, the shock was paralyzing. For her friends, the guilt was immediate and heavy. Many would later admit they wished they had pushed harder, asked deeper questions, refused to accept her reassurances that everything was fine. As Derek was transported back to Louisiana, investigators focused on reconstructing the final hours of Marissa's life. What they uncovered was a slow-burning confrontation rather than a sudden explosion. Text messages recovered from Derek's phone showed that the argument had resumed shortly after they returned home from dinner. Marissa had expressed hesitation about continuing the relationship, stating that Valentine's Day did not magically erase months of emotional strain. Derek's responses grew increasingly desperate, then hostile. He accused her of wasting his time, of humiliating him, of planning to leave him for someone else. The emotional temperature in that townhouse had risen steadily, suffocatingly, until it finally boiled over. Neighbors' accounts, forensic evidence, and digital timestamps began to align into a chilling sequence of events. At approximately 12:47 a.m., Marissa attempted to leave the bedroom. A lamp was knocked over in the struggle, its shattered base later found near the doorway. Bruising patterns suggested that Derek blocked her exit, grabbing her arms as she tried to pull away. What followed was not quick. It was violent, sustained, and deeply personal. Manual strangulation requires time, pressure, and intent, and investigators believed Marissa remained conscious for long enough to understand that the person hurting her was the man she had trusted most. If you're listening to this and feeling anger, sadness, or disbelief, those reactions are valid. These are the moments where quiet engagement, liking, commenting, sharing, helps amplify stories that expose the reality of intimate partner violence, not as an abstract concept, but as lived experience. After Marissa was dead, Derek did not immediately flee. Evidence suggested he sat in the room for nearly 40 minutes, pacing, texting drafts of messages he never sent, opening and closing apps on his phone. One unsent note found later in his drafts folder read simply, "I didn't mean for this to happen." Detectives would later point out that intent is not erased by regret, and violence does not become accidental because someone wishes it away after the fact. At 1:58 a.m., Derek finally left the townhouse. He did not call for help. He did not check for a pulse. He locked the door behind him, taking Marissa's phone with him as he walked into the night. That detail mattered. It spoke volumes. Taking her phone meant delaying discovery, controlling the narrative, buying time. And time, in cases like this, is often the difference between escape and accountability. During his interrogation, Derek presented himself as overwhelmed, confused, and emotionally shattered. He claimed the argument had spiraled out of control, insisting he never intended to hurt Marissa. But when detectives pressed him on specific moments, on the bruises, the timeline, the choice to leave, his story began to fracture. Details shifted. Explanations contradicted evidence. At one point, he went silent altogether, staring at the table as though he could disappear into it. Silence, too, told its own story. Prosecutors would later describe Derek's behavior as a textbook example of escalation in abusive relationships. The pattern was unmistakable: possessiveness framed as devotion, jealousy disguised as concern, apologies followed by control. Valentine's Day, rather than softening these tendencies, intensified them. The symbolism of the day, the expectation of closeness, commitment, and reassurance, became a trigger instead of a comfort. When Marissa did not respond the way Derek wanted, he reacted not with heartbreak, but with violence. As the case moved forward, public attention intensified. Media coverage sparked conversations across the city about warning signs, about the dangers of romanticizing control, about how often abuse hides behind gestures that look like love. Candlelight vigils were held outside Marissa's workplace. Strangers left notes at the townhouse door, messages promising that she would not be forgotten. Each tribute was a quiet acknowledgement that this was not just a private tragedy, but a collective failure to recognize danger soon enough. Behind bars, Derek waited. He listened as the world slowly learned who Marissa really was, and as prosecutors built a case that would strip away the version of himself he had so carefully maintained. The trial loomed ahead, and with it, the possibility of answers that Marissa's loved ones desperately needed, but answers that would come at a painful cost. Because the truth, when finally spoken in a courtroom, has a way of cutting deeper than silence ever could. If this story has stayed with you, if you find yourself replaying these moments in your mind, you're exactly where these stories are meant to land. Staying engaged helps ensure that what happened to Marissa Cole is not reduced to a headline, but remembered as a life stolen too soon. The trial of Derek Vaughn began on a gray morning nearly a year after Marissa Cole's death, and by then, Valentine's Day had permanently changed meaning for everyone who had loved her. Inside the courtroom, rows filled quickly with family members, friends, reporters, and strangers who had followed the case from the beginning. The air was heavy, not with drama, but with the quiet tension that comes when people know they are about to hear things they cannot unhear. Marissa's parents sat together in the front row, hands clasped tightly, bracing themselves for details they had tried for months not to imagine. From the prosecution's opening statement, the narrative was clear and deliberate. This was not a tragic misunderstanding. This was not an accident fueled by temporary emotion. This was a calculated act born from entitlement, control, and rage. Prosecutors framed Valentine's Day not as a coincidence, but as a catalyst, explaining how the expectations of the day intensified Derek's need for reassurance and dominance, and how Marissa's resistance, her quiet insistence on emotional honesty, was something he could not tolerate. They told the jury that Marissa had been trying to reclaim her autonomy, and that choice had cost her her life. Witness after witness took the stand, each one adding another layer to the portrait of Marissa and the reality of her relationship. Friends testified about late-night phone calls filled with tears, about moments when Marissa sounded exhausted rather than happy, about subtle shifts in her behavior that now felt painfully obvious in hindsight. A co-worker described seeing bruises once, faint and easy to explain away, and how Marissa laughed it off, saying she was just clumsy. That laughter echoed uncomfortably through the courtroom, because everyone there understood what it really represented: survival through minimization. The forensic testimony was clinical but devastating. The medical examiner explained the mechanics of strangulation in calm, precise language, detailing how long it would have taken, how much force was required, and how conscious Marissa would have been as it happened. There was no dramatization, no emotional flourish, just facts. But facts, when presented plainly, can be far more disturbing than any dramatic retelling. Several jurors looked down at their hands. One wiped away tears. Marissa's mother closed her eyes and did not open them until the testimony ended. Derek's defense attempted to frame the killing as an unintentional act triggered by emotional distress, arguing that he loved Marissa deeply and that the argument had simply escalated beyond control. They pointed to his lack of prior violent convictions and his expressions of remorse after the fact. But remorse, prosecutors reminded the jury, does not undo violence. And love, when it demands ownership rather than respect, ceases to be love at all. When Derek took the stand, the courtroom fell into a tense stillness. He spoke softly, often hesitating, claiming that he never meant to hurt Marissa and that he panicked when things went wrong. But under cross-examination, his narrative unraveled. Prosecutors confronted him with his messages, his movements, his decision to take Marissa's phone, his choice to leave her alone on the floor rather than call for help. Each question narrowed the gap between what he claimed and what he had done. And in that narrowing space, the truth became impossible to avoid. As the jury deliberated, Marissa's family waited in silence. There were no tears left, only a deep, aching fatigue. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, there was no celebration, no sense of relief. Justice, when it arrives after such loss, is quiet and incomplete. Derek Vaughn was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never again experience Valentine's Day as a celebration. Marissa, however, would never experience it at all. In the weeks that followed, Marissa's name became part of a larger conversation about intimate partner violence, about how easily warning signs are dismissed, about how love is often confused with sacrifice. Her friends started speaking openly, urging others to trust their instincts and to take control seriously when it appears masked as devotion. Her parents established a small foundation in her name, dedicated to supporting people who feel trapped in relationships they are afraid to leave. It was their way of ensuring that Marissa's life would continue to matter beyond the manner of her death. Every year now, on February 14th, flowers appear outside the townhouse where Marissa once lived. Some are red, some are white. Others carry handwritten notes from strangers who never knew her but feel connected to her story. Valentine's Day was meant for love, for warmth, for connection. In Marissa Cole's case, it became a reminder of how easily love can be twisted, and how vital it is to recognize when devotion turns into danger. If this story moved you, if it made you angry, sad, or reflective, those emotions are part of why telling these stories matters. Quietly supporting this channel, through a like, a comment, or a subscription, helps keep these conversations alive and ensures that lives like Marissa's are not reduced to statistics. Marissa Cole was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a professional, a woman who believed in love. And her story, though tragic, continues to speak long after the roses have wilted.